Hi, hello. Won't you be my neighbor? I'll be your neighbor if you don't mind that, unlike the real life guy who was non-stop patient, when I walked myself into Burr's to get kindling, I used some creative language. But let's be neighbors and have some story time. Why I went to go get kindling is because I made myself a beautiful little autumn fire. And here we can see benches that I helped build with a skirt to hold the legs stable instead of diagonal supports. Back there we have a 100-year-old drag saw with a hit and miss engine that my dad used a metal detector to pick out the pieces sunken into the dirt with all of the wood pieces composted, and then an Amish family built all of the wooden pieces to support the metal saw pieces that were only visible in a catalog image of an old drag saw. But I thought maybe we would have story time outside on one of the last days where I don't necessarily have to wear a jacket, to be out in the countryside that is so familiar to me that this is where I put my zombies when I had a nightmare and needed to show myself I could get through zombies. Here is, oh my gosh, it's so glary. How are we even going to see each other? I guess I don't need to see my screen. We have pudgy pie irons and brooms and marshmallow and hot dog sticks. And look, there's an axe for splitting. There are a couple other axes and lots of other saws, but this is what's in the woodshed right now. So I am not BSing you when I talk about both the countryside and chopping wood and building fires. That is really something I do in life. That is the portion that is not fiction. We should talk sometime about how much of fiction is not fiction. I definitely wanted to sit close to the fire because it'd be cozy. Even if these big, beautiful wind chimes keep going. But I think that there's going to be too much smoke. So I'm going to set up here and then go get our books. See my picnic table? You laptop are now sitting and shaking on a bench that I made that I just showed you a moment ago. We'll see if this is an okay place to read without smoke, but close enough to be cozy. I really definitely cheated when I was making this fire. I used like an entire newspaper to make us a cozy fire for story time. Happy autumn. I'm going to talk about why I have my sunglasses, not because I'm worried that somebody's not going to like them, but because I think everyone should know that these are amazing and that they should go get some. Instead of constantly buying and losing prescription sunglasses, you can in fact just get these at a dollar store and they go right over your regular glasses, and then they have this fabulous dorky croaky and then you don't even lose the ones that you got for $1. Plus the string that keeps them from getting lost is also only $1. Life hack. I do feel like you're kind of low on the bench. I'm going to set you on this. Real life. Okay, let's have an outdoorsy story time with a big old lesbian professor in a Mr. Rogers sweater and outdoorsy lesbian lumberjack life happening for you. Where did we leave off in Ophelia Immune? I'm sure she's been building fires and things. So Ophelia and Swan are now friends. Ophelia has gotten her a door that locks, and they have proposed a secret knock. And Ophelia is getting her real food and took her out on a thieving adventure and realized that she doesn't know how to swing an axe either, and neither does Jim, the scientist that she is meeting at the clinic to donate her blood, who knows she's immune. And she had her arm cut off by girl sellers who were trying to take Swan. But her human parts keep healing, and her zombie parts don't let her die all the way. So she's stuck in this middle ground with no dreams, no literal dreams when she tries to sleep, and she wakes up almost frozen because she couldn't build a fire while her arm was healing. Okay. So, didn't put chapter numbers on here. Do not remember what number this is, but this chapter is called The Defrosting. When I defrosted Juliet, I burned a chair into cinders to get the stones hot enough to line the blankets that I wrapped around her. Smoke gathered along the ceiling, like this. It made the room warm, so I didn't fan it away. I crouched near the door where I could still see and waited. I peeked at Juliet after an hour. A small trickle of black fluid was starting to run from the corner of her immobile mouth. She was beginning to thaw. I wrenched her hands away from her face, peered closely into the crack between her lips. Her tongue wiggled ever so slightly. It was time for hot water. When the spoonful stopped pooling in her mouth and ran, steaming and gurgling down her throat, I put one end of... Oof. You know, this fire was a really cozy idea, but if that happens too many more times, we're just going to move. I put one end of old refrigerator tubing into a full pot and the other end in my mouth. I sucked lightly, enjoyed the tingling hot water, but as soon as it was flowing without any suction from myself, I slipped the tube into the back of Juliet's mouth and let it siphon there. Her throat overflowed with draining water and soaked the blankets. Her tongue wagged, her lips began to wrap around it. Her jaw creaked and popped into place around the long, hot straw. Her hand leapt to my forearm and gripped it like a vice while she suckled. I stroked the hair away from her forehead and whispered her encouraging words. Shh, that's it. It's okay. Slowly, not all at once. Let those puddles even out. You're okay. As the water drained from the pot, her legs began to move in slow-motion circles under the blankets. One hand clutched me, the other grasping reflexively in the air. She began to perspire, transparent gray beads of sweat. Her tummy was steaming and distended with water. I snaked the tube out of her throat. Her face snapped to attention in my direction. Her eyes were still black and frozen-looking. She rolled nimbly to her hands and knees and crawled up on top of me, her jaws clicking at my neck. I held her up by the shoulders, gazed at her eyes, cloudy and murky. I held her up by the cheekbones and looked for her pupils. They were gone. Her eyes were solid, creamy rocks. I wiggled one handful of fingers in the air near her face. Nothing. I snapped those same fingers. She roared and lunged for them. She was blind. Warm, distended, awake, and blind. Back in the world of the moving, but not seeing anything. Not seeing me, not dreaming, more just like a dirty fish than ever, flopping and writhing, puffing and bulging eyes and a horrible gasping mouth. I hugged her to me as she writhed, her wet nose rubbing against my ear while she worked at chewing through my 2 scarves. I pulled tight-wristed wool mittens onto Juliet's hands and duct-taped them to the sleeves of her sweater. I stood on her mittens while I wrestled puffy 2 big snow overalls up over her legs. I zipped them as far as the waist, then forced one arm in after the other. She twisted and writhed while I fastened the hood. She hated the hood, but she couldn't manage to claw it off. Her claws were mitted, and her arms could hardly bend through the immense layers of synthetic down encasing her like a sausage. She walked to me like a scarecrow, her arms out at her sides, her feet shuffling about in cold tennis shoes. That would never do. I had better steal her some new boots. In the meantime, I cut a pair of my wool socks to fit over her shoes. They stretched tightly and made her feet slipperier. She fell down into the table that she couldn't see and knocked over the dried flowers. She didn't see them hit the floor. She bounced from the refrigerator to the counters and the walls, listening for something that moved. She moaned in frustration. I banged my shins on a chair, trying to sweep up the glass from the broken vase. My shins tingled. The smoke was getting too thick. I couldn't see now either. I felt my way to the window and ripped open the curtains where I had nailed them. I clattered the windows open in its worn tracks and wafted the smoke out with my hands. Juliet fell down again with a soft thump. Her arms made whooshing noises as she waved them about, making an ash angle on the soot in the floor. Smoke billowed out of the window into the night. The deep dirt of the city called to me. The cool dark was welcome on my face. I could use a visit to the clinic, leave some of my blood behind, stop watching my sister clatter around like a cockroach. With my new big brown book that I had rescued from Swan wrapped in my arms, I leapt onto the fire escape, and then my sneakers slapped against the pavement, leaving behind a canopy of smoke streaming out of my window. Nobody would want to deal with that. A man in a tattered raincoat bolted away when he saw me coming, without even knowing that I was a zombie. I waved at his back as he went. I'd seen him before, jumping in all the dumpsters that I did. He has good taste in dumpsters, which I crawl on top of now, stomping to distract the only zombie in the alley from chasing him. It's as slow as molasses monster, and would have been frozen if it had been outside for long. It must be fresh. It died a second time underneath the heavy weight of my new leather book. I squashed its head like a grape between the dumpster lid and the back of the cover, which I wiped on my jacket after I pulled the body up into the bin, flattened hairline first. The moon winked at me, lighting my way to the clinic. I couldn't see the stars. The slinking snow clouds buried them, and the flickering street lamp disguised them. I wondered why scientists didn't try to get us to live on the stars. They looked so much happier. But both the moon and the stars looked cold, hanging on the wires above every alleyway. Probably no zombies would get to go there, not even if they learned how to read. My scientist Jim was just pulling the last of the boxes inside when I rounded the corner. He pushed 2 of them back outside for us to sit on, and rested easily on top of one, and patted the other for me. The squiggles on the side of the box told me that I was using Petri dishes as my chair. "Hello," I rattled. "Hi, Ophelia. Welcome back." Jim pointed to my new papery friend. "What do you have there? Looks big enough to kill with." I did. He only paused long enough to swallow once, and then looked the covers up and down for black smears. I cleaned off the last of them. "May I see it?" He leaned in. I hesitated, but let him pick it up. He opened up the thick front face. His eyes moved across the pages and flipped through more than I had yet dared. "Is it good? What kind of book is it?" I asked. "Not very many pictures." "It's a very good book," he said. "What you have there are the complete works of Catherine James, and I dare say that one of your parents thought it was a good book, too." "Why?" "Your name is in one of her plays." "Plays? You've never heard of plays? There are actors on a stage in a theater with chandeliers and candles and spyglasses so that you can see better." He held his fingers in loops up to his eyes. He stood up on a box and raised a finger into the air, pointing to the heavens. In a booming voice, not caring who overheard, he shouted, "To breathe or not to breathe?" He looked at me for recognition. I stared up at him, impressed by his tone, convict steam swirling through my teeth. "How about the sonnets?" he asked, climbing back down to sit. "Surely you've heard of Catherine James' sonnets." "Sonnets?" I repeated the new word, wondering how many times my parents had said that same word. Or which one of them? Dad who tucked flowers in his lapels, or Mom who loved civilization? For whom had they named me? Why didn't they give me any books that weren't maps? I couldn't have written these squiggles with my crayons. They were too busy keeping me alive. And they had failed at that, too. They failed to make me dead. I counted the pages as Jim flipped them, stopping 23 to a section labeled with the number of a famous highway, the number 1. He gingerly stroked the page, cleared his throat, and glanced up at me as he began. He read to me of coldness and lightness and death and love without edges, through lyrics that rhymed and rolled over my damaged brain on wheels made of feathers. I hummed. Look, he said, thanks for coming back. The doctors inside of the clinic really need your blood, and if you keep coming back, I'll keep reading to you. He handed me a large, empty vial. His fingers brushed mine. They were clean and hot, with nothing growing under the nails and no mud ring where his sleeves ended. He jumped back, and I dropped the vial on the ground. It hit with a dull plastic clank and rolled in circles. I backed away from his superheated, breakable fingers. I didn't want to kill my doctor. He blushed and tossed the vial back to me. Is my blood worth this risk? I asked, turning my back to him so that he wouldn't have to see my gore while I added a fresh cut to my reattached arm. But he came around and stood in front of me. He talked while he pulled on a pair of thin plastic gloves. Absolutely. We're using it to formulate a viable cure. A cure? Really? From using my blood? A cure? We're still working on it, but your blood really helps us determine the difference between regular blood and infected blood, better than the fish blood does, or even the monkeys. What? You have fish in there? Disgusting. Dangerous. Look, Ophelia, if you keep coming back here to hang out with me and give us more blood, I'll teach you how to read. You can't do that for free, I said. I should give you something. More than blood. Sure, you can protect me while we read. An ex-librarian that had been flopping out of the broken fourth-floor squatter's window above us finally fell and splattered on the pavement, freed from the sill where she had been tangled. Would Jim have just run away if I hadn't been here? I won't always be here to protect you. I should train you. Train me? As I watched the zombie with a fraying bun and cat's eye glasses get to its knees, I thought about who had trained me to kill the undead. Dad was a great teacher with all of his exercises and drills, but in the end, even he hadn't been able to keep his ex-kids from wandering alone forever. Could I do better? Could I teach somebody to have aim? Could I teach somebody how to finish the job? Well, I considered, winter is for the beginner, as they say. They say that. Where? Do they say that in the boonies? When it is cold, zombies are nice and slow, on their way to freezing, easy to hit. The first lesson is to be ready, Jim. I handed him my hammer and took my axe to the ex-librarian, its name tag dangling from its sweater and its claws still dripping a date stamp. You stand behind me, knowing that if I fail, you have something to do, all right? I jabbed it in the chest to knock it upright and then swung my axe horizontally from right to left, splicing the neck clean through. I always kept my blades nice and sharp. The body crumpled to the asphalt. The head hit with a soft plunk and began to open and close its jaws slowly. Jim squinted at the head under my boot. I rolled the head onto its face so that he couldn't see the eyes. What do I do? He asked, tucking an orange curl out of his eyes. You take my axe. Actually, I'm going to add more wood to the fire, and then I'm going to move us because the smoke has been cozy and ridiculous. Whee! No matter how many times you've done it, you still make your eyes water with smoke. Yep, this is exactly where the smoke is going. Right exactly where I said. Oh, Ophelia's had to deal with this so many times. Ophelia understands. It's cold enough that my nose is running. Now we're far enough from the fire that I might have to put my hat on. We'll see. Okay. I feel like me in. Jim squinted at the head under my boot. I rolled the head onto its face so he couldn't see its eyes. What do I do? He asked, tucking an orange curl out of his eyes. You take my axe, I said, and I pointed in a line across the head from ear to ear, and then you make a medium hard splice right here. He raised my axe only about half as high as he should have, and then he made up for it by slamming it down on the back of the head as hard as he could. My axe cut through the tissue like it was butter and the bone like it was a cracker, and it hit the pavement like it was a railroad stake. I winced and took my weapon away from him. I was going to have to sharpen it this morning. Hey, that was kind of cool. He made a fist and pointed his thumb upwards. Yes, well, okay, good job. In the winter, you can wait for corpses to freeze before you move them. I have another one near my house just like this, the one I killed with a book. You can go on inside and get warm. Come back in an hour or so, and this one will be ready for dismantling and disposing. He beamed and flushed from cheeks to his ears, bunching his pristine white pocket fabric between his fingers. The clinic swallowed him up again with his boxes and clipboards. I pointed to the moon and told it that I understood. The scientists were working for both of us, my sister and me. I walked home slowly, kicking at cans and clingy paper flyers that were too wet with snow to burn. I took my time cleaning up my book kill, careful not to further nick my sharp blades while I dawdled with the pieces that didn't quite fit into the heaping trash mound. I whistled to think of the cure for Juliet and for me. Maybe they could fix her eyes, too, make her whole, let me carry her home with no infection following us, no fishy presence among healthy humans, no screams flowing out of the alleyway in front of our ramshackle squatter's home. I paused. The screaming that I could hear right then sounded a lot like Swan. I ran around the corner, and there she was, challenging a slight, scrappy, wind-blown man with ropey muscles under his tattered tunic. He was twitching back and forth, trying to decide whether to run away with the scared young girl who stood by his arm, or to strike at Swan. She was hovering near them, holding her marble rolling pin high above her head. She inched closer to the man, threatening him with stuttered taunts and ill-swung jabs on behalf of the girl who cowered at his side. When she missed, he reached out and struck her. I was too far away to stop him. It didn't look like he hit her very hard, with his elbow next to her chin, but she fell down on the concrete, her rolling pin clattering next to her scrawny, jacketless frame. The girl who was being grabbed by the man screamed and cowered away from Swan's fall as much as she did from the man. She hunched her shoulders, looking away from both of them, and wailed at the icy ground. The man paused, again deciding between kicking Swan or turning tail and running somewhere with the screaming girl. I sprinted directly between Swan and the grimy man. I peered at him, blowing my stench of rot in his face and packing my axe against my palm with taut, violent slaps. He took a step backwards, puffed out his bony chest, and pulled the girl by a fistful of her rags. I shook my head to warn him. She wasn't his yet. If she could stop her screaming, she could decide where to go all by herself. The second girl I'd saved. His chest deflated. He slunk further and further away from me towards the bigger streets around the corner, still holding the girl by her holey sweater, his knuckles wound round the meager strands. I set my booted feet a few rapid paces closer to them. He scurried. I stomped again. He turned and ran, leaving the girl behind. The girl looked at me. She looked at the disappearing man. She heaved, retched, clawed at her own face. She screamed at the top of her lungs, tripped, recovered, and ran away, barefoot, as quickly as she could. She didn't want to follow me like Swan had. "What on earth are you doing out here without a jacket?" I asked my ginger tag-along. I tucked my axe into my belt and held up my hand to hold her rolling pin, while she peeled herself off of the ground with a fat lip and a bloody nose. She tucked her rolling pin haughtily under her own arm. "I was saving that girl," she glared up at me. "You didn't answer your door. Somebody had to do something." "No, somebody did not. You could have been killed. Look, you're broken." "I am not that fragile and helpless. It's just a bloody nose." "Yes, you are. You are bleeding. If he punched you too hard, you would die. You don't know how to fight." "So teach me. I am not so fragile, and somebody did have to do something." She clutched at my arms with her bare hands. I noticed a spot where my arm was leaking black blood through my crusty sleeves, where I'd cut myself to donate the blood. I pushed her off of me. "Don't touch me." "Fine." She spat at my feet and stalked into our building. I followed her up the stairs. She slammed her door in my face. All 3 of her new combination locks clicked closed. "Also," I muttered through the door, "we need to learn how to read." "Go away," she yelled. I sulked to my own door, but then remembered that I had left the furniture piled against the door from the inside. Juliet scratched at me from the other side. I trudged heavily back down the stairs, went back outside into the chill, propped a trash can back up under the fire escape, which was no longer leaking smoke. I kicked it back against the wall and pulled myself back up onto the landing. The curtains were still flapping in the wind, welcoming me home to our stale, cozy place. Juliet urgently smeared her nose at me on the other side of the window pane, reaching for my skin, her sightless eyes rolling. "Hello there," I patted her hands. She popped her head horizontally along the open slit of the window, tongue rubbing against her teeth. Her teeth glittered in the low light. But something was missing. Something was wrong. Juliet had a new, wide, raw, black oval around her mouth, a gaping hole to let her teeth out. She had rubbed her lips off. She had rubbed them off onto the nails that I hadn't bothered to re-smooth after ripping the curtains open to let out the smoke. Now she had fish gills to match her grotesque pupils. I groaned. I stood and leaned my head against my hands, my full weight against my elbows on the rickety escape railing. I groaned more loudly. I leaned further, daring the thin middle to let me fall and crush my skull. A figure below ran away from my moans at his fastest limp. I panted, I yelled, I screamed until my throat ripped itself raw and gurgled as it slid behind my teeth. There wasn't going to be anything left of Juliet to cure, not if I wasn't more careful. I clenched my teeth and looked up at her again. She snapped at me through her new ragged mouth that might never ever heal. What did I let happen to her? To everyone. What was going to happen to Swan and Jim if I didn't look out for them? How could I train them so that this wouldn't happen? How could I do any better? My own training hadn't even worked for me. I'm trapped here, half dead, with my decomposing little sister throwing herself out of a window at me. I kicked the railing bars until they bent. I threw an already broken and worm-filled flower pot down to the ground, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. I didn't want this to be Juliet. I didn't want this to be Swan. I didn't want this to be Jim. I didn't want us to fall farther and farther apart before there wasn't a cure. I pulled Juliet's hat and hood tighter around her face and pushed her back in the window by the top of her head. I tethered her safely to the refrigerator and sanded down the sharp nails while I waited for my coffee to boil. I bore down on them until the shards of metal in the sills were just sparkles tucked into the curtains and flush with the wall, until they were again buffed to an unhazardous sheen. I stirred my pot of coffee with my longest finger, urging the scorched grounds off of the bottom. I licked the drops from my knuckles and poured the steeped brown comfort into a big green mug with pine tree and tent silhouettes. My wrist shook as I carried it, wobbly from the strain of rubbing nails. Well, I think we have some training to do, I told Juliet. Remember how I knew how to club skulls long before their ages? They have no idea what they're doing. They need some help. Even better help than what we got. They didn't have any firewood to chop to build up their muscles. They didn't have any solid cages to keep sleeping inside of. They didn't have anyone to teach them about zombie killing. They didn't have any parents to look out for their education. Neither did I. We would have to look out for each other. And that is the end of the chapter, The Defrosting. I hope you are also having a beautiful autumn day, possibly while breathing less toxic smoke into your lungs while being cozy. Won't you be my neighbor?